On October 31, 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther walked to the castle church in Wittenberg and nailed a document to the wood. That document contained 95 theses, a series of complex arguments about the authority of the Pope and the nature of Christian salvation. Luther was an academic, and he expected a standard theological debate among his peers. Instead, his arguments escaped the university. Within 2 weeks, copies of his text had spread entirely across Germany. Within 2 months, they were circulating throughout the rest of Europe. The engine behind this velocity was the printing press. Invented roughly 60 years earlier, it hadn't yet been deployed to its full disruptive potential. Now, it took a local academic complaint and instantly multiplied it. For over 1,000 years, the Catholic Church had successfully managed religious dissent. Their strategy was simple: isolate the critics and suppress the text. But Luther's ideas, married to the mechanical reproduction of the printing press, presented a completely different problem. The Church found itself facing an argument that its existing power structures were physically incapable of containing. To understand Luther's challenge, look at the Catholic Church of 1517. It was Western Christendom's spiritual authority, Europe's largest landowner, and a major geopolitical force. Most importantly, it was the sole gatekeeper to salvation, the only institution allowed to broker access to the afterlife. What specifically triggered Luther's anger was a massive fundraising campaign. Pope Leo X needed capital to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. To get that money, the Church leaned heavily on the sale of indulgences, official documents sold for cash that promised to reduce the time a soul would spend in purgatory. A friar named Johann Tetzel was traveling through Germany selling them with a pitch so brazen, promising that the moment a coin rang in his coffer, a soul sprang from purgatory, that it disgusted even devout believers. By reducing divine grace to a simple financial transaction, the Church turned its most powerful leverage into a vulnerability. It laid the central pillar of its authority bare for Luther to attack. Luther argued that the Pope had no actual authority over purgatory, and that buying a piece of paper could not guarantee entry into heaven. He proposed that salvation came through faith alone, sola fide, and could not be brokered or bought through the Church. In 1520, Pope Leo X gave Luther 60 days to recant or face excommunication. Luther responded by gathering a large crowd in Wittenberg and publicly throwing the papal decree into a roaring fire. The situation quickly escalated far beyond the walls of the Church. In April 1521, Luther was summoned before the Diet of Worms, an imperial assembly presided over by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. They showed Luther a pile of his own writings and demanded he recant. He refused, stating that unless he was convinced by scripture and plain reason, he could not and would not back down, declaring that to act against one's own conscience is neither safe nor right. Charles V declared Luther an outlaw of the Holy Roman Empire, a sentence that essentially legalized his murder. Before he could be captured, a sympathetic German prince intercepted Luther and had him hidden away in the remote Wartburg castle. By openly defying the two most powerful men in Europe and surviving, Luther broke the monopoly. He successfully shifted the ultimate arbiter of religious truth from a centralized institution to the individual human mind. During his 10 months in hiding, Luther remained busy. He translated the entire New Testament from Greek into highly readable German, making it possible for ordinary people to engage with Scripture directly, without a priest acting as an intermediary.
But the movement was already growing beyond his control. Inspired by these new concepts of Christian liberty, German peasants began to interpret Luther's theological rebellion as a mandate for social rebellion, violently rising up against the aristocracy. The resulting Peasants' War horrified Luther. He aggressively distanced himself from the uprising, calling on the ruling princes to crush the rebellion. They did, slaughtering approximately 100,000 peasants. Meanwhile, other reformers were building their own systems. In Geneva, John Calvin developed a comprehensive theological framework centered on the doctrine of predestination, the rigid belief that God had already predetermined exactly who would be saved and who would be damned. Calvin's fiercely disciplined ideology spread through the Huguenots in France, to Scotland via John Knox, and eventually crossed the Atlantic to the Americas. What started as one monk asking for an academic debate had fractured Western Christianity into multiple, distinct belief systems spanning the globe. This fracturing plunged Europe into over a century of catastrophic violence. The French Wars of Religion alone killed an estimated 3 million people, marked by events like the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, where thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in a matter of days. This chart shows the demographic collapse caused by the 30 Years' War. Between 1618 and 1648, the conflict killed approximately 8 million people. That is roughly 1/3 of the entire population of the German states, wiped out in a single generation. The sheer scale of the carnage eventually forced an end to the fighting. In 1648, the exhausted factions signed the Peace of Westphalia. This treaty established a new set of rules for Europe. It formalized the principle of state sovereignty, establishing that the ruler of a state, not an external religious leader, had the right to determine the religion of their own realm. The era of a single, borderless religious authority dictating European politics was over. The massive centralized power once held by the Catholic Church had been permanently broken and redistributed to individual sovereign nations. The aftermath of all this conflict produced an unexpected cultural dividend. Because Protestantism insisted that Christians must read the Bible for themselves, it drove massive, widespread investments in public literacy and education. This push for literacy did more than just create readers. It shifted the seat of authority. Once millions were told that their own conscience, rather than an ancient institution, was the ultimate guide to truth, that mindset of private judgment began to extend beyond theology. It provided the intellectual framework for individuals to observe the natural world and challenge established facts, clearing the path for the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Martin Luther died in 1546. He was a brilliant and courageous figure, but deeply flawed. In his later years, he produced viciously anti-Semitic writings, calling for the burning of Jewish synagogues, texts that Nazi propagandists would eagerly cite 4 centuries later. Yet his impact is inescapable. The modern West, a world defined by competing denominations, sovereign nation-states, and the belief that the individual conscience is the highest authority, is a direct product of the fire he started. We are still living in the Reformation.